If we're running out of time, I'll speed up a
We
bit.
scheduled to finish at
And you can say it goes to.
but I am obviously I.
It's just, for anyone who's not from the institution, or indeed anyone in the institution, I'm Paul Boyle. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of Swansea University, and I'm very, very pleased to be able to come along to this lecture this evening. I've been looking forward to it for some time now. It's my great pleasure, of course, to welcome Professor Ray Monk to Swansea University. Thank you very much indeed to find the time to come and deliver this lecture, Wittgenstein in Swansea, something we're very proud of course. Professor Monk is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy, I think at the University of Southampton, and of course a world-renowned expert on Wittgenstein, and is indeed the author of a number of related books. I think the biography of Ludwig van Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius, for example. So somebody who's coming to speak to us, of course, who is an absolute authority, and we couldn't really ask for a better speaker. He's also written celebrated biographies of Bertrand Russell and Robert Oppenheimer, of course, which is very relevant to the topic today. Professor Monk's lecture is the culmination of today's conference. And again, thanks to all our colleagues and all of you who have, if you've been able to attend, thanks in particular to those colleagues who pulled together all the work that's gone into that conference. Ludwig Wittgenstein, an Austrian in Swansea. And it also, of course, augments the exhibition that's been put on. And again, a lot of work went into that, I know, in the library to pull it all together. And that, of course, is called the Tractatus Odyssey and Wittgenstein Swansea Years. I really hope that many of you have had the opportunity to have a look at that, and if you haven't, please do take the chance to go along and have a look. I'd also like to give a very warm welcome and indeed heartfelt thanks to the partners for these events. The Austrian Cultural Forum from London and the Wittgenstein Initiative in Vienna. So thank you very much indeed for your work in helping us bring this various activities together here in Swansea. We're very pleased to have been able to participate. And we're very delighted to have a delegation of Austrian friends with us here this evening, and of course are very much looking forward to this being a continuing relationship. It isn't all about what we've done in these last few days, it's about what we're going to do in the future as well. Of course, Swansea University is immensely proud of its connections with Wittgenstein and the legacy of his thought and what's gone into the School of Philosophy at Swansea, but with Rush Rees as its chief architect of that work. Our Richard Burton archives contain a wealth of Wittgenstein-related material, and we're very proud custodians of the Rush Rees archives and papers of D.Z. Phillips. I know that our archives colleagues would extend a very warm welcome to anyone who wishes to view those, and indeed if you wish to conduct research on them, even better. We'd like to bring as many people as we can into thinking around these topics. Back to tonight's proceedings, thank you very much everyone for coming along. It's wonderful to be able to have these face-to-face events, although, of course, we do have a live stream, so there'll be many other people joining us live for this event. But as I say, it's great that you've been able to attend today, and it's really nice to see many of our colleagues. We need more of these events as we go forward. Swansea, of course, is an international university. We're proud to welcome scholars from all over the world, and this is a fantastic example of doing that. And I know that we're all very keen to hear much more from the real speaker tonight, the person we're really here to listen to, Professor Ray Monk. So, Professor Monk, over to you.
Thank you, Paul, for those very kind words. Thank you all for coming. And like Paul, I'd like to thank the organisers of the event, Alan for inviting me, the Wittgenstein Initiative and the Austrian Cultural Forum. For me personally, it's wonderful to be back in Swansea. I came here many times when I was writing my biography to meet with Rush Rees, who was enormously generous with his time. And he had enormous stamina. He was already a fairly elderly man. But I used to go to his house at 9 o'clock, discuss the Wittgenstein papers that he had, the conversations he'd had with Wittgenstein, his memories of Wittgenstein. We'd keep going until the evening, and then the next morning we'd start up all over again. He was a tremendous man and a great credit to Swansea, I think. So it's great to be back in Swansea. I'd forgotten how beautiful it was, but it's nice to be reminded of that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows even the basic facts about Wittgenstein. So I'm going to, before I get on to Wittgenstein in Swansea, I'm going to run through a bit about Wittgenstein in general, emphasizing some of the things that I'm going to return to when I talk about Wittgenstein in Swansea. So let's start at the beginning. He was born in 1889 into a fabulously wealthy family. His father earned a very great deal of money in the iron and steel industry and used it to buy very opulent houses, the most opulent of which was this one pictured here, the Palais Wittgenstein, which no longer exists. But this is where he grew up, and you can see the grand staircase, the red salon. It was an incredibly luxurious home. The Wittgenstein family not only had wealth, they also had immense talent, and they were very interesting, but there was also tragedy in the family. So in the middle we have his father and mother, Carl and Leopoldine, Poldi. On the left there we have at the back his three sisters, Helena, Jemina, Gretel, Margaret, Paul and Ludwig. Paul became a concert pianist. But then on the right, we have, in addition to those five, Kurt, who's on the rightmost, standing very proud in the picture, Hans, who's behind him, and Rudy, who's lurking in the shadows on the left-hand side of the picture. All three of those brothers committed suicide. Hans did so in very tragic circumstances. Carl, as I've said, was an industrialist. He was in the iron and steel industry. Hans was a musical prodigy of Mozartian talents. He was composing concertos before he was 10 years old. He was an extremely gifted pianist, and he wanted to be a composer. Carl resisted this. Hans ran away from home, went to America, fled to America, where his body was found in Chesapeake Bay, and it was assumed that he'd committed suicide. Hans was the oldest. The next oldest was Rudolf, who wanted a career in the theatre. He went to Berlin to seek a career in the theatre. Various things went wrong in his life, and he killed himself in a very dramatic fashion. He went to a bar, he ordered the pianist to play a sad love song, and killed himself in the bar. Then Kurt, so the Hans and Rudolf killed themselves when Ludwig was a small child in the early years of the 20th century, 1903, 1904, 1905, those sort of. Kurt killed himself at the end of the First World War in 1918. He was an officer in the Austrian army. The story is, it's been disputed, but the story that I've heard is that the men under his command refused to obey his orders, whereupon he thought the only honourable course open to him was to shoot himself. Now, the suicides of Hans and Rudolf changed the family dynamic a bit, and Karl Wittgenstein became a little bit more flexible, so that Paul was not only allowed to, but was encouraged to pursue his musical talents and to become what he wanted to become, which is a concert pianist. The tension that had existed between Hans and Rudolf and Karl with regard to the boys wanting careers in the arts and Karl wanting his industrial empire to loom larger and to be first and foremost in their priorities. That tension is there's something a little bit odd about that, because the Wittgenstein family under Karl was right at the heart of Viennese cultural life at a particularly exciting moment of its history. It's when Brahms was still alive. Brahms was a friend of the family, a regular visitor to the Wittgenstein Palais. A number of Brahms's works, including the Clarinet Quintet, received their first performance at Wittgenstein's home. Labor was a kind of family composer. It was a time when artists such as Klimt and Kokoschka, Schiller, were developing new forms of art, and they formed the secession movement. Their building, which is still there and it still looks like this, was funded by Karl Wittgenstein, who also patronized many of the artists involved in the secession movement, including Klimt, and he commissioned Klimt to paint this rather lovely painting of Margaret, Ludwig's sister. The music salon there, you see, is where Brahms and others played. So the Wittgenstein family, to live in that home at that time was to be in direct contact with many of the people changing the way that the arts were developing. And not just the arts, also intellectual life. Margaret here was the main intellectual influence on Wittgenstein during his early years, and she encouraged him to read the satirist Karl Kraus. She encouraged him to read the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who became Wittgenstein's, the first philosophical influence on Wittgenstein was Schopenhauer, and you can still see Schopenhauer's influence in the Tractatus written many years later. So he received all the intellectual and artistic stimulation he needed from his family at home, as opposed to the school he went to, which was a rather mediocre Realschule in Linz, which is famous only for being the school that Adolf Hitler attended. This photograph has been doing the rounds. It's supposed to show Adolf Hitler and Ludwig Wittgenstein in the same photograph. It's generally accepted now, I think, that that is indeed Adolf Hitler, but that is not Ludwig Wittgenstein. They went to the same school. They were practically the same age. They were born just within days of each other, but they were never in the same class at school because Adolf Hitler was kept a year behind and Ludwig Wittgenstein was pushed up a year forward. So there were 2 years between them, in fact, at school, even though they were just days apart. So here we have the early influences on the young Wittgenstein, the early intellectual interests. Arthur Schopenhauer, I've already mentioned. Weininger is an interesting case. He was all the rage in Vienna at the turn of the century. His book, Sex and Character, went through several printings in its first year. It was first published in 1903, and it's one of those books that everybody read. And Wittgenstein read it, and it had a profound influence on him. When he gave it to people in Cambridge and said, look, read this book, they were really puzzled because the view that it expresses is, to put it bluntly, balmy. The view it expresses is this, that man and woman are two distinct Platonic types, and only man can ascend to the ethical realm and use reason. From an ethical and intellectual point of view, according to Weininger, women are a lost cause. He says they don't really think in concepts. They think in what he calls henids, which are the pre-concepts. You know, when you're trying to think of a word and you haven't quite got it, That, according to Weininger, is what it's like to be a woman. And that's why women seek men more intelligent than themselves, so that they can put into words the thoughts that they don't quite have. Now, so that is what the book is most famous for, and I don't think that had any influence at all on Wittgenstein. However, I do think that the view of Weininger's expressed in this quotation, logic and ethics are fundamentally the same, they are no more than duty to oneself, that, I think, did have a profound influence on Wittgenstein. And it's why I called my biography The Duty of Genius. The genius is concerned with two things, logic and ethics. Thinking clearly and behaving decently. And it's a striking aspect of Wittgenstein's life and personality that everything in his life was stripped down to concentrate on those two duties, which are fundamentally two parts of the same duty. And you can see that in everything he wrote, you can see that he took that absolutely serious. And not just everything he wrote, but everything he did. Wittgenstein's life, as I say, was very stripped down. He never married, he never owned a house, he never took a career very seriously. He inherited a vast amount of money, but he experienced it as a sort of burden, and he gave it away. He gave it to his sisters because he said, look, they're already so rich, it's not going to harm them. But he himself wanted to lead a very simple life dedicated to thinking clearly and becoming a decent person. Intellectually, unlike his brothers, his thoughts ran to engineering. And he studied engineering in Vienna and then in Berlin. And then he came to Manchester to do some research on aeronautical engineering. And in particular, we started with flying kites in Glossop. And Rush Rees says in his recollections on Wittgenstein with regard to Glossop, he says, where in truth there is wind enough. You know, it's pretty windy up there. So Wittgenstein flew some kites trying to learn something about aeronautics. He then became interested in designing a jet engine. And this led him to philosophy in this way. There's a number of steps here. So he was interested in designing a jet engine. And he began to concentrate on the propeller because the engine he had in mind is a rather unusual type where the plane is to be propelled by the spin of the propeller, not in the way that ordinary propellers are, but rather in the way that something like the hose of a sprinkling hose that you use to water your lawn. The force of the water is driving the hose around, and similarly, Wittgenstein's design involved jets of air driving the propeller around. And he went so far as to patent his design, and the patent was taken up for a particular make of helicopter in the Second World War. But the way it led to philosophy was that he concentrated on the propeller. The design of the propeller turned out to be essentially a mathematical task, so he got interested in mathematics. He started attending lectures in pure mathematics at Manchester University, and then he became interested in the question, what is mathematics? And he met with other mathematics research students to discuss this essentially philosophical question. They recommended that he read Bertrand Russell's Principles of Mathematics, which is one of the few things that had been published fairly recently on the subject of the philosophy of mathematics, and specifically on the question of what is mathematics. Russell put forward the idea that mathematics is really part of logic. And the old question that had bedeviled philosophers of mathematics about what numbers are, it's one of those, when you ask what numbers are, it's one of those questions that seems simple, and it gets more and more difficult the more you think about it. So if you have 3 apples and you add 2 apples, you get 5 apples. Fair enough. But 3 plus 2 equals 5 is not about apples. And it's not about any other instantiation of that. It's about numbers. But what are numbers? Russell's answer is that numbers are a particular kind of abstract object called a class. A class is a group of objects. Let's say a class of apples. Now, the members of that class are going to be physical objects, apples. But the class itself is not a physical object. But according to Russell, it is some kind of object. It's an abstract object. You can't touch it, you can't smell it. Nevertheless, it is an object. Therefore, we can have a class of them. We can have a class of classes. That led to Russell to arrive at the notorious Russell paradox, which threatened to destroy his entire theory. The paradox goes like this. Okay, you have a class of classes. Therefore, you can have the class of all classes. Now, the class of all classes will have a peculiar property. It will be a member of itself. But most classes aren't. The class of apples is not an apple, so it's not a member of itself. So now group together all the classes of classes that are not members of themselves and ask the deadly question, is that class a member of itself or not? If it is, then it isn't, and if it isn't, then it is. Russell, once he'd discovered this paradox, devoted himself to the solution of it, and in the Principles of Mathematics, he has a chapter devoted to it. It didn't put him off publishing his theory that mathematics was logic, but he published the theory together with a chapter suggesting that there's a big problem with this theory that comes out of what he called the contradiction, the paradox. And he recommended all serious students of philosophy to devote themselves to trying to solve that paradox. And Wittgenstein got obsessed with trying to solve that paradox. And he wrote, when he was still an engineering student at Manchester, he wrote to Russell in Cambridge saying, I found a solution. Russell, consulted a few friends, wrote back saying, no, you haven't, it doesn't work. And Wittgenstein lost interest in his engineering studies and became devoted to the philosophy of mathematics. Now, being Wittgenstein and coming from the kind of background he did, he didn't do anything as mundane as apply for a place at Cambridge. He just took a train down to Cambridge, stormed into Russell's lecture room, and announced himself as Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was now going to attend Russell's lectures. A letter survives on that day that Russell wrote to his lover, Ottilie Morel, saying they didn't know whether this man was a lunatic or a genius. And this was in October 1911. At the end of that term, the Michaelmas term in Cambridge, Wittgenstein went to Russell and said, I want to devote myself to philosophy, but I won't if you think I'm an idiot. And Russell said, well, I don't know whether you're an idiot or not. Write something on the subject, show it to me when you come back after Christmas. Wittgenstein did, and Russell said, no, you're not an idiot, you must devote yourself to philosophy. So he did. He devoted himself to the question, what is logic? And he worked 1911, 1912 to 13 at Cambridge under Russell, trying to find an answer to that question. Then after having a holiday in Norway in the summer of 1913, he again burst into Russell's rooms, and Russell, in a letter, describes it like this, that Wittgenstein burst in and said that he was now going to leave Cambridge and he was going to live in an isolated hut in Norway and work on his philosophy. Russell said, I said it would be dark, and he said he hated daylight. I said it would be lonely, and he said he prostituted his mind talking to intelligent people. I said he was mad, and he said, God preserve him from sanity. God certainly will. So Wittgenstein spent that year working on logic and made some headway. The headway he made was to think that Russell, and before him the German mathematician Gottlob Frege, had arrived at contradictions in their logic because they hadn't understood something essential about logic, namely that it is what Wittgenstein called ineffable. It is inexpressible. Something in logic works. Logic tells us what you can and cannot derive from other propositions, but you can't say anything about logic. And he'd arrived at that by the summer of 1914. He went home to Vienna in the summer of 1914 with the intention of going back to Norway to he thought that then he was just about to finish his book. But of course the First World War broke out and he wasn't able to go back to Norway. And so he abandoned that plan and instead signed up to the Austrian army. Now, what he was trying to get from being a soldier in the Austrian army, Russell thought he signed up for patriotic reasons, and of course there's an element of that. But I think more interesting and more telling is the influence of William James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which Wittgenstein had written in a letter to Russell that he'd been reading just before the First World War. And in that book, William James gathers together testimony of people who've undergone a religious conversion. And one thing that appears again and again is facing death. And I think Wittgenstein thought that if he could sign up to the war, experience facing death, this would have a transforming effect on his life and his personality and make him a better person. What he wanted from the war essentially was to be a better person. So he signed up to the war. He didn't face death for the first 2 years of the war. He was behind the lines, and there was a sort of comical series of events where he wanted to, go to the front, but the authorities thought, oh, he's Wittgenstein, he's from that very wealthy family, we'll keep him in an engineering shed behind the lines. During that time, he chanced upon Leo Tolstoy's The Gospel in Brief, which he carried around with him all the time, so much so that his fellow soldiers called him the man with the Gospels. He read it so often he knew it practically off by heart. And again, it had a profound effect upon him. The theme of one theme of Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief is this: that true religious faith, true Christian faith, does not show itself in what you do and do not believe. It shows itself in what kind of person you are. It shows itself, as it were, in what you do from the heart. And that remained Wittgenstein's view for the rest of his life. Now, something interesting happened when he finally got his wish to go to the Russian front in 1916. Up until then, he'd been writing remarks about logic and language in German, and then he'd been writing remarks about himself and personal remarks in a code that he'd learned from his sisters. But in 1916, something remarkable happens. He starts to write about non-logical and non-linguistic things, not in code, but in ordinary language, as if they're part of his philosophical thinking, including this one: what do I know about God and the purpose of life? To believe in a God means to understand the meaning of life. To believe in God means to see that the facts of the world are not the end of the matter. The solution to the problem is life is to be seen in the disappearance of the problem. Isn't this the reason why men to whom the meaning of life had become clear after long doubting could not say what this meaning consisted in? Now, what's striking about that is it's nothing to do with believing in the existence of God, as if that were a proposition like believing in the existence of London. It's more to do with a transforming effect of your faith. And in particular, it's to do with seeing the world differently. Seeing the world differently in a way that you cannot put into words. Now, I said that this was now, it looked in his notebooks as if this is now part of his philosophy. It was indeed part of his philosophy, and it's part of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which, when it was published soon after the First World War, was a very strange book indeed. 5/6 of it is about logic and language. And he puts forward the theory that the meaning of language, to understand the meaning of language, you have to understand two isomorphic structures: the structure of the world and the structure of language. Language is made up of names, the world is made up of objects, and the names in a proposition picture the arrangement of objects in the world because of the linking between the referential link between the names and the objects. But you can't have a proposition of religion like that. And as he'd already said before the war, you can't have a proposition of logic like that. So certain important things, logic he'd already said, philosophy, religion, ethics, the meaning of life, these are all things that are inexpressible. And he says in the Tractatus, there are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. And in aesthetics, in art, it is hard to say anything that is as good as saying nothing. And when Paul Engelmann illustrated that with the poem Kant Eberhard's Hawthorne, Wittgenstein replied, "And this is how it is. If only you do not try to utter what is unutterable, then nothing gets lost. But the unutterable will be unutterably contained in what has been uttered." So the book was published in German in 1921, in English in 1922. Wittgenstein thought, and he writes in the preface, that his book solved all the main problems of philosophy. He wasn't a humble man. And accordingly, he gave up philosophy because he'd done it. He'd solved philosophy. And so he then got a job teaching elementary school children in the Austrian countryside. And although, in some ways, he was a very inspiring teacher, particularly with very gifted pupils, he taught them logic, he taught them mathematics. But these are farmers' kids. Most of them weren't particularly interested. And that drove him crazy, sometimes to the point of violence. And sometimes he hit the children. And there was a tribunal to assess his case as a violent teacher. And that persuaded him to leave teaching. Because and his sisters had told him this already. Himina, his oldest sister, had already said that he just wasn't made of the kind of stuff that a successful elementary school teacher in rural Austria is made. He wasn't that kind of person, and it was kind of obvious to everybody who knew him that he wasn't. And he came to that conclusion himself in 1926, left teaching, went to Vienna, and reinvented himself as an architect. He designed this house, Wittgenstein, he designed with his friend Paul Engelmann. And at that stage, whenever he filled in a form and it said profession, he would write architect. And it is a very striking house, as you can see. It's a very starkly, unadorned, modernist house. Now, why? Given that Wittgenstein adored the culture of the late 18th and early 19th century. He described Mozart and Beethoven as the sons of God, the true sons of God. Why is he building a home for his sister? This was Gretel's house. Why is he building a home for his sister in this stark modernist style? The reason for that is that, yes, he thought that culture, the culture that had produced Mozart and Beethoven, was a pinnacle of Western culture. But he also believed that it was over, and the First World War had confirmed him in that belief. And given that it was over, to do anything in that style, whether in music or architecture, literature or painting, was to be dishonest. The only honest thing to do would be to acknowledge that culture had gone and to embrace the new. So it wasn't that he thought that this modernist style was any better than any of the Baroque style or any of the styles that had flourished in the 18th and 19th century. It wasn't that he thought that style was better, just that that was the only honest way now that one could design a building. He also tried his hand at sculpture and produced this rather striking, I think, and again slightly austere bust of a young lady. But then Frank Ramsey came to see him. Frank Ramsey was a genius. He died at the age of 26, having made original contributions to mathematical logic, philosophy, economics, all kinds of things. He got very interested in the Tractatus, became persuaded that although it was the most interesting philosophical work that he'd ever read, it was also wrong. And he went to Austria and had discussions with Wittgenstein and persuaded Wittgenstein that he was right and that the theory, particularly the theory of logic in the Tractatus, was simply wrong. That persuaded Wittgenstein to return to Cambridge in 1929 and start anew. And he didn't just tinker at the edges of his theory in Tractatus. He developed a completely new way of looking at philosophy, one that abandoned entirely this idea of logical form, the idea that there is isomorphic structures, one tied to another. He abandoned that completely and abandoned also the idea that the way to understand logic was, the way to understand language was to understand its structure. What he started developing was the idea that the way to understand language was to understand life, to understand the things we do. Language is embedded in actions, customs, things that we do. So he wanted to adopt as a motto for the book that was never published in his lifetime, Philosophical Investigations, a line from Goethe, echoing the first sentence of St. John's Gospel, Im Anfang war die Tat. In the beginning was the deed, not the word. You don't start with the word, you start with the deed. You start with actions, customs, conventions, things that we do. And that's what he's developed from 1929 onwards. He also started getting away from the idea that it's the relationship between a name and an object that is the center of philosophy. Rather, he says, what's central, well, he abandoned altogether the idea that the task of philosophy is to construct any theory, whether it's a theory of logic or language or whatever. The task of philosophy is not to develop a theory. It's rather to achieve what he called the understanding that consists in seeing connections. For example, he had this Galtonian photograph made of himself with his four sisters. So we've got Hermina, Helena, Margaret. Margaret's the one with the beads, and Ludwig. Superimpose one on top of the other, and now you can see, literally see the connections. You're not theorizing now, you're seeing the connections, the family resemblances between Wittgenstein, let's say his eyes, his mouth, his nose, and those of his sister. The key point here, though, is that seeing those connections is not a prelude to understanding, it is the understanding. That's what understanding consists in. Rather than what? Rather than a theory put in words. Central to that is changing the way we see things. And he was very fond of this example that he got from Jastrow, the psychologist, of the duck rabbit. You can see this as a rabbit looking left or as a duck looking right, and you can change at will whether you see it as a duck or as a rabbit. Now, what changes when you change the aspect under which you see this picture? It's tempting to say, well, the image itself doesn't change, that stays the same. What changes is the image in your mind. But that can't be right, because the image in your mind is going to be just a duplicate of the image here. So it's not that any object changes, it's that the way you see the object changes. And that, I think, is fundamental. Well, it's whether it's fundamental or not, it's the aspect of Wittgenstein's later work that interests me the most, and I think the aspect that is foremost in his discussions in Swansea. So he moves to Swansea in he first goes to Swansea in 1942. Earlier, Alfred had shown this postcard. It's a postcard to his friend Ben Richards from Swansea, and he's scribbled at the top here, pointing to the civic centre. He says, "This abomination is the joy and pride of Swansea." But despite him thinking this was an abomination, he loved Swansea. And I'll get on to why he loves Swansea later on. But he wanted to be alone to work on his philosophy unless he was with people that he really trusted, like Rush Rhys. In Swansea, he could have daily meetings with Rush Rhys, which was a large part of the attraction of being there. Just before he died, he tried the opposite approach and spent time on his own on the west coast of Ireland, in Ross Row, in Connemara, in this house here, which is now a youth hostel. It's in a very beautiful spot. It was owned by his friends, the Drurys, who let it to him, and also employed a man to come and give him peat, which he used to burn for warmth and so on. And I met this man, lovely Irish countryman, and he told me that every day he'd go down there to the cottage, give Wittgenstein his peat. Every day there would be a pile of manuscripts of Wittgenstein's that he wanted this chap, who I think was called Jim, he wanted this chap to destroy. There were Wittgenstein manuscripts that, and I said to him, well, weren't you tempted to keep them? I mean, they would be worth a fortune now. He said, oh no, they had writing all over them. After Ireland, he got ill, he went to Cambridge. These are the last photographs of Wittgenstein alive. He died in Cambridge, and his very last words to his hostess, Mrs. Bevan, were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Now, let's go back to Rusheries. Rusheries was what drew Wittgenstein to Swansea. Here's the Rusheries I remember on the left. As I say, Rusheries was incredibly generous to me. He used to pay for me to stay in a hotel near his house, and then I'd go and meet him and we'd discuss Wittgenstein. And he had two of these Rottweiler dogs. You can see one of them under the chair there. And these dogs used to tussle with him with manuscripts of Wittgenstein's. And sometimes we'd go out walking with the dogs. Sometimes we'd stay in chatting. Wittgenstein described Rhys to his friend Norman Malcolm, an excellent man and has real talent for philosophy too. Now, Rhys came from a family not quite as grand as Wittgenstein's, but they're a pretty distinguished family. Rhys' father was president of the University of Rochester and a Baptist minister. He was called Benjamin Rhys. And their slightly distant ancestor, I think if you go back 3 or 4 generations, was a Welsh Baptist minister who emigrated to America and founded a Welsh colony in Pennsylvania. Rhys, so what attracted Wittgenstein to Rhys? I think, and I had experience of this myself, Rhys was completely unaffected. He had no side, as they say. There was nothing pompous about Rhys, nothing pretentious about him. He just wanted to get at the truth. That is the only thing that concerned him. In his discussion, he wouldn't try and win an argument or anything like that. He would just try and get at what is true. And I think that impressed Wittgenstein. And I think his total integrity impressed Wittgenstein, and also his indifference to money impressed Wittgenstein. After all, Rhys came from a fairly wealthy family. He didn't need his salary. He refused to take his salary. I think he was an ideal partner for Wittgenstein in discussion in another crucially important way, which is this, that Wittgenstein could discuss with Rhys things that were highly relevant to his philosophy, but weren't the kind of things that he could discuss in Cambridge with his academic colleagues. For example, Freudian psychoanalysis. Rhys kept notes of his conversation. Wittgenstein would be a bit like me and Rhys, except that he was Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein would chat with Rhys, and when, at the end of the day, Rhys would make notes of their conversations. And he had hundreds of these papers of notes. And when he and I were talking at his home, and we come across some topic, he'd say, wait a minute, and he'd go to where he kept all these papers, and he'd bring out a paper where he and Wittgenstein were discussing that very topic. These conversational notes really should be published. They're absolutely fascinating, and they're a great record to show just how wide Wittgenstein's interests were. They weren't confined to logic and language or mathematics. We'll show some things that they extended to. Here's Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, what I want to say about the range of things that he discussed with Rhys is that although they appear very disparate, they have an important thing in common, which is that in every case what Wittgenstein wants to say is that confusions in this area arise from pretending that it is a science. So he says, when we're studying psychology, we may feel that there's something unsatisfactory, some difficulty about the whole subject or study. Because we're taking physics as our ideal science, we think of formulating laws as in physics. He said the same thing about philosophy, that we go wrong in philosophy because we think that philosophy is a bit like a science. And we see the generality of science. Science always wants to generalize. It always wants to take a particular case, link it with other cases, and provide a general law. And mathematicians want to do the same thing. They want to generalize a theorem. In philosophy, Wittgenstein says, we do the opposite. We draw attention to the multiplicity of the phenomena. We don't try to subsume them under a single category. And he thought that was how he'd gone wrong in the Tractatus. Excuse me. He tried to take a single notion, logical form, and show how this applied to all language and all thought. He's now got rid of that notion of logical form. He's replaced the emphasis on structure with the emphasis on the things we do, and he's abandoned the effort to in any way emulate science. So he says, for example, about Freud's dream interpretations. When a dream is interpreted, we might say that it's fitted into a context in which it ceases to be puzzling. In a sense, the dreamer redreams his dream in surroundings such that its aspect changes. This notion of a change of aspect, the duck and the rabbit back to the duck, is used by him to say what's happening. When we have a dream and somebody interprets it for us, they haven't given us a scientific explanation of that dream. And if they've succeeded in improving our understanding of it, it's because they've changed the way we see it. They've changed the aspect under which we see it. Now, Rees set up a philosophical society in Swansea, and he invited Benjamin Farrington, who was professor of classics here at Swansea, to give a talk. Farrington was a Marxist, and he gave a talk called Causal Laws and History, in which he tried to give a Marxist analysis of historical development and progress, in which he appealed to some kind of notion of causality. Wittgenstein, in the question and answer period, said, a historical change may be progress, and it also may be ruin. An example that Farrington gave that Wittgenstein was happy to accept was here in South Wales. In some sense, progress was made in developing the coal industry in South Wales. But in other ways, it led to ruin because it ruined the landscape. And it led to people doing something that was not only hard work, but also ruinous for their health. And also, what had previously been a pretty valley was now full of soot and dust and coal slags. So, he says, a historical change may be progress and it also may be ruin. There's no method of weighing one against the other to justify you speaking of progress on the whole. This is a phrase that Farrington had used, progress on the whole. Farrington had acknowledged that in some ways the development of the coal industry was ruinous. Nevertheless, he thought there had been progress on the whole. Farrington replies, with all the ugly sides of our civilization, I'm sure I would rather live as we do now than have to live as the caveman did. To which Wittgenstein replies, yes, of course you would. But would the caveman? So, 42, 43, Wittgenstein spends whatever time he can living with Rush Rhys, talking about Freud and about history, about politics, about anything that he wants to talk about with Rush Rhys. But then he moves in with Mrs. Mann, who lived in the Mumbles, and you can see, well, you all know why anyone would live in the Mumbles, and Wittgenstein moved there in March 1944. He then, which he enjoyed very much, Mrs. Mann was a good landlady and she looked after him very well, But he got to know the Reverend Morgan, who lived in Cumdonkin Terrace in Uplands, and he moved there in 1944 with the Reverend Morgan and his wife. And these are pictures taken with Wittgenstein's camera, which, as you can see, is not a particularly sophisticated SLR or anything like that. But Wittgenstein was enormously attached to this camera, and he took hundreds of pictures with it and kept them in photo albums. And he had a strange habit of taking a razor and sort of cutting slithers off the photograph to produce just the right sort of dimensions. He hasn't done it with these, but he's done it with many others. So bottom left, we have the Rev Morgan. At the top, we have his wife, Mrs. Morgan. And then on the bottom right, we have Mrs. Clement, who lived at number 1 Cumdonkin Terrace. So the story is that Wittgenstein lived for a while with the Rev Morgan, who was a minister. Wittgenstein used to make fun of him for having loads of books. His walls were lined with books, and Wittgenstein used to tease him about this, saying he's just got this to impress his congregation. But they would discuss religion. And the Reverend Morgan asked Wittgenstein, "Do you believe in God?" And Wittgenstein said, "Yes, I do. But the difference between what I believe and what you believe might be infinite." What did he mean? He meant something like what I was saying about Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief, that for Wittgenstein, a religion, again, is centrally to do with what you, with the customs you take part in, the things you do, the going to church, the singing of hymns, the saying of prayers, and so on. It's not crucially to do with saying, here's a proposition which I believe to be true. You know, God exists, meaning there is something to which the word God refers. That's not how he understood religion. So he was, in a sense, religious, but probably not in the sense that the Reverend Morgan was. Now, Mrs. Clement, who lived at number 1, Wittgenstein grew enormously fond of, and she didn't take lodgers, but Wittgenstein insisted. He was a very strong-willed man, and so he moved in with Mrs. Clement. And earlier today in the conference, we heard from Mrs. Clement's grandson about how his mum and his auntie, who were then girls, how and he said that as far as they were concerned, Wittgenstein was just part of the family. He could be exhausting. He loved being with the girls. He loved reading with the girls. He loved educating the girls. And he loved playing snakes and ladders with the girls. But you know what snakes and ladders is like? Sometimes it can go on forever because you'll go up the ladder and then you'll keep falling down the snake. And one particular game of snakes and ladders went on for hour after hour. And eventually the girls begged Ludwig to give up this game, and he refused to do so until somebody had won the game legitimately. Now, what else? So he liked the people in Swansea. He liked discussing philosophy and everything else, this wide range of subjects with Rush Reeves. What else did he like? Going for walks. So he wrote to Ben Richards, "I've been for a lot of very lovely walks lately," and you can see the countryside around here appealed to him enormously. And there's no great mystery about that. It's lovely countryside. And he was very keen on walking, and he took many walks around the Gower and around this whole area. And when he went to America, he wrote to Rush Reeves and said, "You know, there are," or Ben Richards, he said, "You know, there are lots of nice walks around here, but not as nice as in around Swansea." He said, "Nature isn't as natural here as it is in Wales." So Swansea versus Cambridge. He loves Swansea. On the whole, he wasn't very keen on Cambridge. To Norman Malcolm, he says, "I'm in Swansea again over Christmas and probably over New Year. The weather's foul." Can you imagine that? And not on a day like this. "But I enjoy not being in Cambridge. I know quite a number of people here whom I like." He's thinking preeminently of Rush Reeves. "I seem to find it more easy to get along with them here than in England. I feel much more often like smiling, for example, when I walk in the street or when I see children, etc." On the other hand, he wrote to Ben Richards from Cambridge, The worst thing about this place is the cold, inhuman atmosphere, which makes me feel lonely and as though I were condemned to live with waxworks. He felt, in other words, in Swansea, he was with people, real people. He often said about Cambridge that what he disliked among both the fellows and the undergraduates was the pretentiousness, the over-concern with appearing to be sophisticated and intelligent, which he felt liberated from when he came to Swansea. Not that people weren't interested in intellectual matters, just they were interested in them in a different way. It wasn't to do with showing how clever you were. It was simply to do with discussing interesting things with congenial people. Now, while he was in Swansea, John Wisdom, the Cambridge philosopher, was writing a biographical paragraph about Wittgenstein, which he sent to Wittgenstein, saying, is there anything you want, any way you want me to change it? Now, Wittgenstein changed it by adding this sentence: Wittgenstein's chief contribution has been in the philosophy of mathematics. Can I do 5 more minutes? Is that all right? Wittgenstein's chief contribution has been in the philosophy of mathematics, which surprised Wisdom, because Wisdom thought that Wittgenstein's chief contribution was the philosophy of language and, at a stretch, the philosophy of mind. But Wittgenstein insisted that the chief contribution was in the philosophy of mathematics, because that's what he was working on. For the first half of his time in Swansea, he was writing what has now become the first part of the remarks on the foundations of mathematics. Now, it's a surprise to many philosophers that Wittgenstein considered his greatest contribution to be in the area of the philosophy of mathematics, because it's not an area of his work that many people have read. And one reason for that is that his original conception of philosophical investigations was never brought to fruition. His original conception was this: he would start with general considerations about language, about the mistake in thinking that the essence of language is the setting up of relations between names and objects. And he would then extend that in 2 ways. One, into the philosophy of psychology, where he talks about the non-referential, if I could put it like that, nature of psychological talk. So when we use expressions like, I've changed my mind, I've got a pain in my heart, we're not using the words pain and heart in a referential way. Nevertheless, those are not meaningless sentences. It's rather that the meaning doesn't come from the relation between a word and an object, just like it doesn't in religion, and just like it doesn't in Freudian psychoanalysis, and just like it doesn't in mathematics. In Philosophical Grammar, which was published after his death, he wrote this: confusions in these matters are entirely the result of treating mathematics as a kind of natural science, and this is connected with the fact that mathematics has detached itself from natural science. For as long as it's done in immediate connection with physics, it's clear that it isn't a natural science. So again, the lesson is the same. We misunderstand mathematics because we try and impose this single pattern, linguistic pattern, upon it. We're puzzled by the proposition 5 plus 7 equals 12. We want to know what it's about, and we implicitly assume, which it's probably not explicit to ourselves, but we implicitly assume we're going to answer that question by naming something, pointing at something that is 5, something that is 7, and something that is 12. Wittgenstein's point in philosophy of mathematics is that's not how these sentences, expressions work. And so what's unique about his philosophy of mathematics? Usually when people say they're working on the philosophy of mathematics, what they mean is they're working on the subject studied by mathematicians. That crucially isn't what Wittgenstein means. He says in the remarks on the foundations of mathematics, it's the use outside mathematics, and so the meaning of the signs that makes the sign game into mathematics. The meaning of the signs, where meaning, to quote his slogan in Philosophical Investigations, meaning is use. If you want to know what 7 plus 5 equals 12 means, see how it's used. See how addition, the concept of addition, is used in calculating how much we pay in shops, how much change we get when we pay in cash on the bus, and that sort of thing. Don't think that it's going to do with identifying things that are numbers. And so, mathematical proof, according to Wittgenstein, consists not in what the vast majority of philosophers of mathematics think it consists in, which is you start with a number of premises and you derive from those a conclusion, which you then elevate to the status of a theorem. That is not what proof is, according to Wittgenstein. Rather, proof is the attempt to get you to see things in certain ways so that you can then go on in a different kind of way. So here's his proof that 4 times 3 equals 12. You count the number of rows, 4. You count the number of columns, 3. You count the number of dots, 12. And then you say, oh yeah, I see. And now you can do that with 5 plus 7 equals 12, and you can do it with other cases. But it's what you do. It's not to do with making logical inferences from other propositions. But after all, it was the making of inferences from propositions that had got Russell into his paradox, which was the original thing that got Wittgenstein into philosophy. So where does Wittgenstein end up with regard to that? With regard to contradiction and the importance of it, he doesn't think it's important at all in mathematics. Contradiction is something in logic. So with regard to mathematics, he says, I should like to ask you something like this. Is it usefulness you're out for in your calculus? In that case, you don't get any contradiction. And if you aren't out for usefulness, then it doesn't matter if you do get one. And again, with regard, I said that it goes in 2 ways. 1, mathematics, 2, psychology. We've got the same lesson with regard to sensations. How do words refer to sensations? There doesn't seem to be any problem here. Don't we talk about sensations every day and give them names? But how is the connection between the name and the thing named set up? The question is the same as, how does a human being learn the meaning of the names of sensations? Of the word pain, for example. Here is one possibility. Words are connected with the primitives, the natural expressions of the sensation, and used in their place. A child has hurt himself and he cries, and then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. So you're saying that the word pain really means crying. No, on the contrary, the verbal expression of pain replaces crying and does not describe it. So when you go to your mum and you say, Mum, I've got a tummy ache, you're not using that sentence in a way in which the meaning of it is to do with finding objects to which the words refer to. Rather, you're using it as a replacement for ah. So, in Swansea, Wittgenstein found ideal conditions to work through various categories of thought, primarily with Rusheries. He also found himself a member of a community that he liked, and this was crucial to him. One of the aspects of his new philosophy expressed in Philosophical Investigations that is crucial to it is that we don't start, just as we don't start with the word and then go on to the deed, we don't start with the I and go on to the you. Descartes' way of formulating the problem is, do I know that I exist? Once I can satisfy myself that I exist, I can then start thinking about the external world and then start thinking about other people. Wittgenstein says, no, you can't even understand your use of language unless you understand that you are part of a community. Well, so here in Swansea, he was part of the community. The second postcard he sent to Ben Richards consisted of nothing but pictures of the Civic Centre. It's got 5 pictures of the Civic Centre here. And it's as if to say, look, even with this abomination, I love this place. And I think one can say about that, greater love hath no man. Thank you very much.
Ray, thank you very much, Ray. Our ugly, lovely chamber and it's, in all its perfections and imperfections. We've got about 5 minutes or so.
I'm sorry for going on.
No, it's all right, no problem, no problems at all. For some questions, so if anyone's got any immediate questions or thoughts, gentlemen at the back. Yeah.
You mentioned that the conversations with Rush Rees are mostly about scientism.
Well, they're diverse, but they have that as a recurring theme. Yeah.
And I just wondered whether it strikes me that Wittgenstein would like to have been the sort of prophet of anti-scientism. I think he thought as strongly as that. And
Funnily enough, that's how I see him.
yeah. No, well, I think it's, and also it is connected with Swansea in a way which connects up with the things we're saying.
Yeah.
Benjamin Farrington was, besides being a classicist, was also very interested in Francis Bacon, the Elizabethan philosopher, who Wittgenstein saw of as the prophet of the scientific industrial age.
Yeah.
Precisely the thing that he was against. And some of the interesting remarks in Culture and Value are on Bacon, comparing himself with Bacon.
Bacon. Okay, yeah.
I think they're very interesting. He says, I'm getting, I might be like Bacon, I might be getting bogged down in details. So that's all part of his Swansea experience. And the connection with the Swansea experience, I think, is not only that he had that conversation with Farrington, but also the book, when he was living with the Reverend Morgan, the book he picked off the shelves was Bacon's Nova Morgana.
Yeah, right.
I sort of wonder whether that connection is something which
That's a nice detail, yeah. No, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that.
Okay, thanks for that.
But no, that couldn't be more relevant. Thank you very much.
Anybody else got any mid questions? Go on.
How and where did Wittgenstein learn English?
Oh,
Yeah.
High school.
sorry?
High school.
Well, at the Linz Realschule, maybe. Did they teach English? I just don't know. They did. You know that.
In the family.
Okay. Well, I mean, his family members would have spoken English for sure, and so he might have learned English before he even went to school. Brad Miller, do you know that's true?
Yes.
Yeah. That would be my guess, because I mean, as I say, they're a highly cultured family, and they employed a wide range of teachers, and my guess would be that at least one of those would be teaching them English.
They all had English governesses?
Yes.
Because in that class of families in Vienna, it was much more chic to speak English than French, while the world thinks that French was not so interesting because anybody spoke French anyway. But English was not the...
English is more chic than French.
Today.
Yeah. That's not how we see it, I don't think.
Anybody? Any other questions or thoughts? Gentlemen at the back? Yeah.
Someone's so obsessed on Wittgenstein on the third reaction, what's the think you would make of people studying him in this lecture itself?
Sorry?
Someone Wittgenstein seemed very obsessed on the third reactions. What do you think you would make of people studying him, his legacy?
Okay, good. So the question, in case you didn't hear it, was more or less, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but why should anyone study Wittgenstein's legacy? Or is it what is Wittgenstein's...
What would he think? What would he think, Ray?
What would he
think of people studying him?
Oh, what would he think of people studying him? Yes, he wouldn't like it. And he didn't like it in his own lifetime. Whenever anybody said Wittgenstein says, Wittgenstein would immediately rush a letter to the newspaper or journal, whatever it is, saying, no, I don't. So he was a nightmare in that respect. And many people fell foul of that tendency of his. On the other hand, there is another hand here, which is he had no time for academic philosophy or academic journals. The most distinguished philosopher of the 20th century never published a single article in a refereed journal. But he did say that what he wanted was for his work to be discovered later. Once he said the philosophical journalists, as he put it, have grown tired of it. So he also used to say that his work was so out of kilter with the times in which he lived that it would have to be many years later that it had some real and genuine influence. So I think you can take from those kind of utterances that he certainly wanted an influence. He was just, first of all, he was super picky about anybody trying to represent his thoughts in their words. And secondly, he didn't think the time was right during his lifetime.
Okay. I think we've got time for one question. John? Right.
Is it known in the posthumous publications which and where the texts and the things were written? And obviously we're interested in any part of the philosophical investigations or other works that can be seen in text written in Swansea.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, and I think one can trace that, yes. So I think we know, so the manuscripts have now been numbered, and I think we know more or less which numbered manuscripts were written in Swansea. So we can identify those. And also, the way he compiled his work was unique, I think. So he would write remarks in notebooks. Then he would take some of those remarks and write them up in a manuscript. Then he'd have that typed. Then he would cut it up and rearrange it. And then he would have it typed again. And we've got surviving examples of all of those things. And also we know in fairly great detail, we can trace the history of remarks. You can take the philosophical investigations, and almost paragraph by paragraph, you can say, oh, well, that appears in that typescript, and then it appears in this manuscript, and then it appears in that notebook. And Peter Hacker and Gordon Baker have done a lot of that in their commentary on the investigations. So it can be done, and it has been done.
Okay, diolch pawb. Thank you, everyone. It's now a pleasure to call on Professor Daniel Williams to give a vote of thanks.
As Alan just said, I'm Daniel Williams. I'm Professor of English and co-director of CREW, the Centre for Research into the English Literature and Language of Wales, if I can put this on. Will it work?
This is Russell's paradox.
Can you just pop it in the pocket? As you see, I'm not a scientist.
Better ask our technical people.
And aren't even going to pretend that I am.
I'm going to hold it.
Yeah, sure. I'll just hold it. Okay. Well, it gives me great pleasure, obviously, to offer a final vote of heartfelt thanks. Diolch o galon. At the end of what's been a memorable day, culminating with a terrific, wide-ranging, suggestive lecture from Professor Ray Monk. You've taken us from the high culture of late 19th century Vienna to the side streets of uplands, tracing Wittgenstein's intellectual development as we travelled. As a professor of English, of course, I can't help wondering what kind of conversation Wittgenstein might have had with Dylan Thomas if they'd encountered one another, which is not impossible, but as Jeff Towns told us earlier, there's no evidence of that. But so much of Dylan's poetry can be placed in dialogue with some of the themes that Professor Monk has been exploring. Wittgenstein does seem to belong to the poets in a way, to modernist poetry, as much as he does with philosophy. He communicates his thoughts while meditating on the medium that he's using to communicate them, as indeed is true of much modernist art, as is true of Dylan's poetry. Wittgenstein would surely have been intrigued, for example, by Thomas's early poem, From Love's First Fever, which traces an individual's journey from conception and seems to focus in particular on the way in which language acquisition results in the one of birth becoming the many of a world divided into words. The process is not presented as a fall or a loss, for the miraculous creative potential of language is always emphasized. And to the miracle of the first rounded word, each golden grain spat life into its fellow. But there's a different tone that enters the poem as it develops. At the end of the 5th stanza, we're told the root of tongues ends in a spent-out cancer. That's but a name where maggots have their X, and the letter X on its own stands at the end of the line. The narrative of the poem here seems to go into reverse, and rather than developing and pluralizing, it returns to the root of tongues to discover there a spent-out cancer, leading to the annihilation represented by the seemingly terminal X. It's a striking, unique moment in Thomas's work. The X perhaps suggesting that the festive linguistic creativity that the poem mainly emphasizes comes at a cost, the cost of some kind of erasure. But what is erased? The influence of Dillon's father on him has been well established, and Dillon copied the final section of the poem into his notebook on the day that his father, DJ David John Thomas, was admitted to hospital for radium treatment for cancer of the mouth. The X, then, is in a way perhaps an X-ray, while also suggesting that the poet is facing the possibility of his father's death. DJ would recover from the operation. But there are other possible aspects to these lines. Why, for instance, does Thomas refer to the root of tongues in the plural as opposed to the tongue's root? Is he drawing attention to his father's bilingualism? As is well known, Thomas's parents were both Welsh speakers with family connections in West Wales. His father, a graduate and secondary school teacher of English literature, lifted his son's then unusual name from the medieval Mabinogi of Welsh myth. He made sure, however, that Dillon would know little Welsh, and due to elocution lessons, would speak English, the language of progress and social uplift, with a resonant enunciation. And Dillon never seems to regret this openly, but he does joke about it sometimes, describing himself like a man with the Elgin marbles in his mouth. Having said that, the recently released 1921 census has the 6-year-old Dillon speaking both languages, according to his father. So the X in this respect is how an illiterate might also mark his name. That is, it represents linguistic loss. And if the poem as a whole is a celebration of the creativity of the English language, we might ask whether these lines suggest that poetic mastery has been gained at the cost of cultural disinheritance, the erasure of a spent tradition, to use the words of the poet, that exists residually in nothing anymore but his name. Is David Thomas's cancer here being evoked in relation to language death? Now, language can't be taken for granted in Wales, which is why the ideas of Wittgenstein found a fertile ground in Welsh language culture among those cavemen, J.R. Jones, Dewi Z. Phillips, and the recently deceased Walford Geely. They weren't literally cavemen, I was just picking up on that story. In the current academic climate, the study of the humanities can't be taken for granted either. We seem constantly to be having to justify what we do. But listening to Professor Monk tonight, and indeed to the papers and discussions that we've had during the day, made me think that we don't really need to be defensive in our answers. It's clear why the humanities matter. They are a series of efforts, divided by disciplines, but often working at the interface between them, to extend and to deepen our understanding of human activity in its richest and most diverse forms across time and space. The question really is, why does this have to be reiterated? Who doesn't get it? What's wrong with them? The rules of the language game that we inhabit don't help us. We heard earlier that Wittgenstein tended to think that a healthy society venerated its poets, its musicians, whereas an unhealthy society venerates its industrialists and businessmen. That might be rather harsh and reflecting his own background, but in the remarks on the foundation of mathematics, he notes that a sick society cannot be cured by the intellectual endeavors of individuals. Something deep within the values of society as a whole have to change. The collaborative nature of today's events, expertly organized by Dr. Alan Sandry, supported by the Austrian Cultural Forum and the Wittgenstein Initiative in Vienna, and brought to a wonderful conclusion in this evening's lecture by Professor Monk, is a reminder of why we do what we do. It's also a reminder of the not insignificant role that Swansea has played in the intellectual life of the 20th century. We heard earlier, as Ray Monk alluded to, Jamie Clement talking about his working class grandparents taking in an Austrian of Jewish ancestry with a strong German accent within the context of the Second World War into their homes. In coupling Wittgenstein's respect for difference with an awareness of what binds us together, I can't help but think of tonight's lecture as an act of resistance within a Britain that is sending asylum seekers to Rwanda and dissociating itself from the European Charter of Human Rights. Oni byddai'n braf byw mewn Cymru annibynnol yn Europe ar hyn o bryd. It would be nice to think that Wales, as the bilingual Austrian Wittgenstein seemed to notice, and as Ray Monk's vibrant and wide-ranging lecture suggested tonight, could be a different country in a world of difference. Diolch yn fawr.